Welcome to Category Visionaries, the show dedicated to exploring exciting visions for the future from the founders who are on the front lines building it. In each episode, we'll speak with a visionary founder who's building a new category or reimagining an existing one. We'll learn about the problem they solve, how their technology works, and unpack their vision for the future. I'm your host, Brett Stapper, CEO of Frontlines Media. Now let's dive right into today's episode. Hey, founders, and thanks for listening to another episode of Category Visionaries. Today, we're speaking with Ravin, CEO and co-founder of Credal, an AI security company that's raised $5 million in funding. Ravin, thanks for chatting with me today.
Thank you so much for having me. Excited to talk.
Not a problem. I'm super excited as well, and I'd love to just kick off with a quick summary of who you are and a bit more about your background.
Yeah, so, as with any person, right, it's really hard to summarize all of me in like 1 minute, but I will do my best to focus on the bits actually relevant to the audience. I think probably the most interesting or most relevant part of my background is just, I'm a person who's always looking for the most impactful thing I can be doing. I care like a lot about just being very laser focused on the thing that I think is most impactful at any given point in time. And honestly, I'm so dogmatic about that it's gotten me into a lot of trouble over the years. I grew up in a very traditional, risk-averse immigrant household. My parents actually fled the war in Sri Lanka. And so given that they lived through this like insane upheaval in their life, they were like very much not risk takers, right? So we ended up in England and I managed to get myself a scholarship place, sort of insanely stodgy British boarding school. And it was kind of comically rigid. It had all these sort of absurd rules and etiquette stuff. And honestly, none of that stuff ever made any sense to me at all. I was there for like 12 years and I never figured any of it out. So I pretty much grew up in this environment where literally the best thing you could possibly do was not think at all about what you were doing and just kind of blindly follow whatever arbitrary the rule of the day there was, right? And obviously that was kind of the opposite of me. I was continuously in all sorts of trouble for resisting these arbitrary rules. And in fact, I think I was the only scholarship kid in the school who got suspended multiple times and then nearly kicked out of the school. And in fact, actually, when it came time to apply to university, my professors at Oxford ended up telling me that I was the only kid they'd ever seen whose recommendation letter was explicitly saying, do not admit this student. You're going to regret it. Ignore the fact they have great grades. They're like a bad kid and they have a huge problem with authority and you should just not let this kid in. And I don't know, somehow they let me in anyway. And while it was a lot better than the school in terms of being able to explore and learn like what I wanted to learn, it did have its own strange norms as well. Like most kids at Oxford at the time did not see it as a way to learn about important, impactful problems. They saw it as a way to get a fast track to high prestige investment banking jobs. And I think back then in the UK in the late 2000s, literally the highest prestige would be to go to, say, McKinsey, where you could sell opioids to rural America, or Goldman Sachs, where you could grift the Malaysian people out of their national wealth, right? And these were literally the highest prestige jobs you could get, drug dealer or international scale grifter, right? And I'm obviously being a little bit hyperbolic, but also like there's a kind of truth in all that. So this wasn't me, obviously. So I did wind up at Google hoping that building stuff would be a bit more impactful. In some ways it was better, but ultimately I wound up joining a fintech startup called GoCardless, which was definitely like more impactful and something I was more excited about. And then eventually wound up at Palantir for 8 years, where I really actually get access to these amazing problems. I worked on rehousing Syrian refugees. I worked on keeping America's hospitals afloat during the pandemic. But, I think I eventually realized that ultimately, if I really wanted to be dogmatic about working on what I felt was the most impactful problem in the world, the best way to do that was at a startup. And really, that's how I ended up starting Credal.
Why do you think Oxford let you in?
Yeah, great question. Well, a lot of it is down to this incredible professor I had, Walter, who I spoke to him about it afterwards, and he got this recommendation letter, and he was also a bit of a rebellious character as well. And so he was kind of like, well, I have to meet this guy, right? Like, this is such a crazy reference letter. I have to meet this person. And so they brought me in and interviewed me. And, my recollection of that interview was that I did a terrible job, but I suppose their recollection of it was a little bit more charitable than that. We did have a really interesting conversation about the role of power in international relations. It was pretty fun. And, I made all sorts of silly mistakes, but it was still a good conversation. And I think that was an interesting and weird enough profile for them that they were kind of excited to just see who I turned out to be. Was I as weird and crazy as the school was saying?
What was it like then at Palantir? So you spent 8 years there. That's a long time. That's a good chunk of your career. I'm sure you learned a ton. What would be some of those like big takeaways that you walked away with?
Yeah, great question. Well, I think one of the things that was super interesting about Palantir when I joined it, so I joined in the London office in 2015, right? And at the time, I'm pretty sure this is accurate. This is obviously going back almost 10 years. So I might be getting the numbers a little bit wrong, but I think we had like 3 customers in Europe in the commercial world. And you could count every single person in Europe who had actually used Palantir. A human being could count all of those people, right? And if you were in the London office, you knew the names of all of the users in all of Europe, full stop. And that was kind of pretty cool in some ways. Like, it's quite analogous to being at a startup where, especially the early days of a startup, where you really do understand like the ins and outs of your users' lives. You know, are they married? Do they have kids? Do they like their job? Do they hate their job? You really get to know them very deeply. And that was like a very, very powerful lesson. I think there was one other thing that was really, really important about like my time at Palantir, which was when I was at Palantir, right? And it seems so obvious that it would be successful in hindsight, but when I was there, it really was not obvious at all. And in fact, I remember at the end of 2016, the company had grown like, I think 3% in the whole year. And that was kind of a disaster, right? Everyone was like, oh my God, the company's screwed. A lot of people left. I remember Carp, like the CEO, he's like a bit of a meme generator now. Like at the end of year talk, he sort of put up this graph and he couldn't really have a graph of revenue because the revenue was flat, right? So instead, the like y-axis on this graph just said charisma. And he was like, charisma has gone up, right? And that's the kind of ridiculous thing that he would do. And we were all like, what the hell is this? But coming through that period and like sticking with Palantir, because I did really believe in its mission, and seeing it get through that sort of very difficult period and become the insane like behemoth that it is today, I think that just taught me like, hey, successful companies go through hard patches, and like the ones that succeed are the ones that find a way out and don't give up. And I think that was like a very, very important lesson for me ultimately.
So as you made your way through Oxford, then went to GoCardless, then you were at Palantir, in the back of your head, did you have the idea that someday you were going to start your own tech company? Or when did that idea really start to develop?
Yeah, it's a good question. I mean, I think when you're at a startup, everyone is talking about like startups, right? And so the notion of starting a startup was not that alien to me, which I will say, like, again, at the time in the UK in the late 2000s, early 2010s, starting a startup was not really something that British people did, right? It was kind of weird. I think when I was at GoCardless, there were essentially 2 interesting startups in all of the UK. And so it was a bit weird. And, you know, my very traditional risk-averse parents were like, this is an awful idea. Why on earth would you contemplate doing something like that? And so the more people tell you that, if you're like a very contrarian, somewhat rebellious person, the more drawn to that idea you are. But to be honest with you, I think the reason that I didn't do it for so long was because I did really, really care about working on extremely impactful problems. And I just didn't feel like I had the ability by myself when I was like 21, 22, 23 to really go away and like make a big dent on what I thought was one of the world's most important problems. These startups, GoCardless and Palantir, and obviously Google was not a startup, but these companies, I felt like they gave me a platform to do that. And it was only when like I'd really felt like I'd learned enough and I like deeply understood the problem spaces that I cared about that I was, okay, like it's time now. Let's go and actually tackle this myself.
Is there a specific moment that you can recall in, looks like what, fall of 22 or maybe late 22, that you decided to go and start your own company?
Yeah, actually, it was very, very concrete. So I was in New York. And Jack's my co-founder, by the way. Jack and I, we were both working at Palantir at that point in these insanely high security environments. So Jack was at the Department of Defense and he was helping them deploy these like combat computer vision models. And at the same time, I was at the Department of Health, right? And I was helping them deploy models to prevent America's hospitals from overflowing from COVID. And we were both playing with these generative models and seeing how insanely powerful they were, but also seeing at the same time, like how insanely difficult it would be to get these large security sensitive institutions like trust and deploy them. And so we had dinner at this Vietnamese place in Chelsea called Oh My, which very sadly is actually closed now. But during that conversation, we just both kind of simultaneously realized, holy cow, this is going to be a massive problem for every industry that touches sensitive data, which is basically every important industry in the world. And we were seeing what we thought was like 2 or 3 years before the rest of the world, but turned out to be much less than that. But we were seeing how insanely powerful the models were. And we were like, getting this technology to be safe and usable on the problems that matter the most to like human welfare, that's just like an insanely valuable problem. We have to go and tackle it because just the upside is so massive to humanity if we do it well. Now, that was in August of 2022 that we had that conversation. We thought we were 2 or 3 years ahead of the world waking up. But what happened was 2 or 3 months later, ChatGPT was released and we turned out to be off by 2 or 3 years, ironically enough. But yeah, that was the specific moment. And it was very concrete, a very specific conversation we had.
Take us back to those early days then. What did the first, let's say, 90 days look like?
It's a lot of chaos, right? I think Jack and I were very determined that we wouldn't be these like naive engineers who would go off and like build a bunch of software that nobody actually wanted. And then we would like struggle to do anything with it. So our goal was very much, okay, let's in the first 7 days, we'll build a demo. And in that demo, once we have that demo, we'll go and start shipping it around as many people that we can get to look at our demo and try and sell it to them, right? And obviously the goal will be like, once you make the sale, then you actually go and turn the demo into something that someone can actually use. And we did actually get a handful of customers. You know, obviously these were not massive contracts, but we did actually sell this like very initial product. The initial product that we ended up with was actually super different to what we wound up with today, because although we cottoned on to how important security was going to be, for some kind of silly reason, we didn't actually understand that the right thing to do was build a security product, right? What we thought we would have to do is just build some kind of very specific AI application and then bake a bunch of security features into that application, and that would help us sell. And so here we were selling this AI application out to a bunch of companies, and they would kind of say like, oh, you know, this product is sort of interesting, but the security features are really cool. But I'm sort of interested enough in you guys that like, you know, I'll give the product a whirl. And there was this one moment actually that was really difficult where we got this pilot with this company called Latcher, which is this very innovative property management firm. It's about 1 to 200 people or 100 to 200 people. And they were using the product, which was at the time like an AI chief of staff, right? It would look at all of your data and figure out what was going on in your meeting and like help brief executives for like exec meetings or all hands. And he took a video of this exec meeting at the end of the pilot. And he asked everyone in the room, tell me, how much would you pay for this piece of software, right? This is a 100 to 200 person company. So we were thinking we would charge like $2,000 a month, something like that. And, you know, that's what we were hoping that they would say. And so we watched this recording and he goes around the room and the execs are like, well, maybe I'd pay like $20 a month. Maybe I'd pay $10 a month. And, you know, you watch that, especially as a founder of like a company, and you realize like, oh no, something has gone horribly wrong. We're off by 2 orders of magnitude on the price that we need here. And that was like a pretty intense moment that happened like, I don't know exactly when, but like 2 or 3 months into the company. And at the end of that, we sort of, Jack and I sat down and we were like, what the hell do we do? And just very shortly after that meeting, actually, we had a meeting with our advisors at YC, and I was writing up the notes for that. And as I was writing up the notes, it was just like super obvious to me that like this business would not work, right? Like there was no way that you could sell a product for like $10 to $20 a month to a 200 person company and turn that into a multi-billion-dollar business. So it was kind of gut wrenching and pretty hard. But in the end, it proved to be like this massive gift, right? Because I think if they'd said, oh, we'd spend $200 a month or $300 a month, maybe we would have continued barking down that like wrong tree or like, you know, trying to pursue this dead end. And actually the fact that we were so far off from what could plausibly work actually accelerated our realization that like, okay, this was not going to work. We should do something completely different. And then we sat down and we were like, this process took a little bit longer, but we sat down and we were like, what have we learned in this failure, right? And I think the thing that we realized was like, look, our original thesis that the security problem is like really big, that's come out time and time again in the sales process. What has not come out is that like anyone cares about an AI chief of staff. So like, let's just focus on the thing that actually we wanted to do in the first place, right? Which is figure out how to help enterprises trust this technology. And I think it was when we realized that we stripped out a lot of the craft in the product and just focused on that. And, you know, that's when our business really actually started succeeding and blowing up, and people really understood what we were selling. And I think That was a really pivotal moment. But honestly, the 90 days to get there was, we were all over the place, making every mistake, and it was hard.
When did you get your first paying customer then to that AI security product?
Yeah. So the AI security product, our first paying customer was actually Checker. And it started out because I emailed the CISO of Checker, and on his LinkedIn, like he kind of mentioned that he spoke Klingon, right? Or he was like interested in Klingon. And so this like outreach email I sent in Klingon, kind of being like, well, let's see what happens. And he picked it up, but he was like, actually, it's funny that you should mention this. This was, I think, February of 2023. It's funny that you should mention this. Like, we're actually thinking about building this exact thing in-house ourselves right now, but I think we'd sort of prefer to buy it from someone. So if you have that product, great. So then Jack and I panicked because we didn't even have a demo for this product at that point. And we like scrambled to create a demo. We met with the Checker team like literally the next day because they were actually pretty urgent about it. And we met with Michael, the CISO, as well as a few other people from around the business. And it was just really, really clear that they wanted to get this done. We ended up signing like a 3-month pilot agreement with the idea being that over the course of those 3 months, we'd like actually build the product, right? And then at the end of that 3-month period, it converted to like a really awesome 6-figure enterprise deal. And that was kind of, I think, when we realized, okay, we had something valuable here. We had something people wanted and something that people really wanted to pay for. And it just kind of kept going from there.
How many other emails did you send out like that? Obviously not in Klingon, but just emails that took an extreme amount of personalization and time and care. How many did you send out?
I mean, if we're just talking about the AI security product here, and we're not talking about the AI chief of staff, it actually honestly was not that many, because what happened was, so a little bit of background context for that story is that actually, when I sent out that email, we'd given up on the old AI chief of staff idea, and we didn't know what we were going to do next. And I had 150 investor calls lined up for the following week, right? And I had no business to pitch these investors, right? Like I didn't even know what my idea was at this point. But because we were in YC, investors had reached out and we'd lined up these meetings for just before demo day. And so we had 150 calls coming up. And so we were like, okay, well, we sure as hell better choose something, right? And so the first choice that we chose, I can't even remember what it was, but it was sort of AI security flavored, but it was different in some particular way. I honestly can't even remember what the difference was anymore, but we sent probably 100 emails for that product, like the day after we decided that the old product wasn't going to work. And none of those got any responses. So we were like, okay, scrap that. We need a different idea. And we're on the clock here. We've got 14 days before the investor meetings start. So we're down to 13 days now, and that's when we sent the emails. And we sent probably about, I think, 50 of the AI security product emails the following day. And 2 of them got responses, like one from Checker and one from this big pharmaceutical company that we're also working with now. It took a little bit longer to close them, but we did get there. And that was, you send 100 emails and get 0 responses for one idea. And the next day you send 50 and get 2. All of a sudden, the sort of part of your brain as a founder that's like, wait, maybe? It really is kind of lighting up. And so it took us about 50 emails, probably sent about half of those. Jack sent half of those, but that was all it took, actually.
This show is brought to you by Frontlines Media, a podcast production studio that helps B2B founders launch, manage, and grow their own podcast. Now, if you're a founder, you may be thinking, I don't have time to host a podcast. I've got a company to build. Well, that's exactly what we built our service to do. You show up and host, and we handle literally everything else. To set up a call to discuss launching your own podcast, visit frontlines.io/podcast. Now, back to today's episode. Just so we can have some context around the scale you're operating at today, are there any numbers that you can share?
Yeah. Okay. So, I mean, we're growing at like 20 to 30% per month. We sign up a new household name business every 2 months or 3 months, I would say. We process over 1 million LLM queries every month. It's pretty insane to have gone from like crazy random idea to something that household names that I grew up using their products as a kid are now using Credal. The team is still super small, which has been great, honestly. It's still a 5-person team. We desperately need to scale the team, but we also are super keen to keep the hiring bar extremely high. And so we've just been a little bit slow on that. But I will say, if there are any great software engineers or product managers or product marketing managers out there listening to this, please hit me up. I can't wait to speak to you.
What do you attribute to that growth? I think any founder that's listening in wants to be able to answer that question in that same way. But for most founders, it's hard. They're not growing that fast.
Yeah.
What have you gotten right? And what are you doing from a marketing perspective to rise above all the noise that's out there in the market?
That's a great question. I think the question of what we're doing right is sort of a funny one, right? Because from my perspective, pretty much everything we're doing right today is something that at some point in the past we were doing wrong, right? And so maybe the sort of takeaway from that is that actually the most important thing to do right is to actually sort of be reflective, embrace the reality of what's not working, and then act decisively to course correct against that when something is not going the way that you want it to go. And I think that's an extremely important part of getting to something that will work. And, at the end of the day, I'm not going to deny that luck played a big part in our role. Who knows? Maybe if Michael had just been out on holiday that week, he may not have responded to my email. I'm not sure. But there's obviously a component of luck that's involved. And so if you act decisively on the things that are not working and keep iterating really fast and course correcting really fast, that's probably like the best way to maximize your chances. And then there was a second component to your question, which I think one of the things that is really, really important when you're in this kind of crazy AI hype wave that we found ourselves in is like actually not getting distracted by like, oh, look, this new model just got released. And oh, look, like this company is saying that they've got like everything that you could ever imagine to be fully automated. You've got to ignore all of that stuff and just stay really, really focused on, okay, you have real customers. Those customers actually have pain points. They've got jobs that they're trying to do, and those jobs are difficult in a variety of ways. What are the things that make that really hard? And how do I like take away the difficulty from a customer? And if you keep doing that every day, your customers' lives are getting easier and easier and easier because of the features that you're delivering, then there's like a pretty good chance that you're doing something right. And honestly, if you stay focused on that stuff, you don't even notice like what's happening in the like broader universe of the noise, as you say on Twitter. One thing I'll just quickly say on this is that maybe for us in some ways, this is a little bit easier because being focused on the security component and the compliance component, security and compliance is always the most boring part of any technological wave. And so maybe we're less liable to get distracted. But I think the principle is still the same. Like if you just stay ruthlessly focused on talking to actual customers, understanding their actual pain points and solving those actual pain points, everything else like will fall into place.
Is most of this growth then coming from inbound or is it coming from outbound?
Yeah, great question. Well, the funny thing is, after that round of 50 emails that we did, we actually did not do any outbound for the longest time until literally the start of this year. So pretty much almost an entire year's worth of time. And everything just came from content that we were putting online because we would work with these customers, we'd solve a problem, we'd write a case study up about it. And then like the head of platform engineering at some 10,000 person public financial services company would like reach out being like, oh, I read this thing that you wrote. It was pretty interesting. Can we chat? And then obviously my job will be to find a way to turn can we chat into like, okay, can you pay me hundreds of thousands of dollars, please? That was a lot of work in and of itself. So I had so much work to do just keeping my head afloat on getting these leads to convert and getting the product to actually work. I just didn't have any time for outreach, to be honest. And it was only like at the beginning of this year, we could sort of put our head above the parapet a little bit and be like, oh, wow, we have a product that works. We have all these customers. Let's go and find the next generation of customers that we actually started to do outreach. So for us, at least, inbound was like definitely the primary driver of our growth. And hopefully, it stays that way. I definitely expect it to. One of the nice things about like once you have like a solid customer base, you start to understand who your ICP is, like who the buyer is, what does the buying cycle look like? And then when you have that, it's really easy to do targeted outbound because you know exactly who's going to be buying you and you can just hit those profiles. So that helped a lot with like bootstrapping our outbound process.
Who is the ICP and what does that buying journey typically look like?
Yeah, great question. So the primary ICP for us is like the platform engineering lead. You look at these big 1,000 to 10,000 person technology companies, they typically have like some kind of platform team, or maybe it's an AI team. And the engineering lead of that team is trying to build a bunch of applications that, they have some applications probably already in proof of concept stage, and they're trying to roll it out to the entire org. And the CISO at the org is like, wait, hang on a second. Like, have you thought about all of these security problems? And then the engineering lead's like, well, I did kind of think about them, but I didn't really want to deal with them, to be honest with you. And that's when they start doing a little bit of research and find us and find our content. And then they'll typically reach out to us. Very often there'll be like a sort of pilot period. Maybe it's 1 month, maybe it's 2 months, where they'll sort of get their hands on the product. And for our customers, like once they've got their hands on the product, they pretty much always end up realizing that it just makes a lot more sense to buy this rather than build it. But yeah, there are some customers, some companies that just really love building their own software for a variety of reasons. And sometimes that makes sense. And so that's kind of typically the decision that they'll have to make is like, do we buy Credal or do we try and build some in-house like custom version of it internally?
What types of terms are they searching for? Because I have to imagine it's slightly different for every team and every person, just because this is such an emerging space.
Yeah, that's totally right. So one of the things that's super interesting for us is like, we are this general purpose platform, right? We're not trying to be a particular point solution, but our users are trying to solve a very particular problem, right? To take the example of like TransferWise is a big financial services company. They were trying to solve like a KYC AML problem, right? And so they would be searching like, how do I protect customer data when using LLMs to do KYC, right? And so for us, like anticipating exactly what the right search term to like go for was actually pretty difficult. So what we try and do is we try and put out like many different case studies across all of our customers about all of the use cases that they're solving and the role that security plays in like actually getting those use cases into production. And that is, we have this AI security guides sort of content series on our website, and we have a lot of blog posts about the specific use cases that customers have solved with us. And I think the combination of those two things has been really helpful because people read it and they're like, oh, okay, I get that this is a general purpose platform, but I also get that it can actually be used to solve my specific problem. And that's kind of really when we're in the sweet spot.
How do you think about your market category? Is this a category that's already being talked about, or is this a category that you have to really define and eventually own?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think, so from my perspective, it's completely a new category, right? Like what I actually believe we are building is very different, I think, to people in general think like ought to be built, which is, from my perspective, what we're really building is the safe and access controlled data environment for your AI employees, because we believe that 5 years from now, every company is going to have hundreds of these AI employees running around doing work. They're going to need to access company data, and they're going to need to access that company data in a way that's controlled and secure, right? But if I go out and say to a customer, hey, this is what you need, they're like, but I don't have hundreds of AI employees, right? What are you talking about? And so when we explain the category, we do it in this very high level sense that people pretty much agree now that there is this sort of AI security category, but most companies have not actually figured out what that really means. Like there's all these different ways that you can talk about security, you can talk about prompt injections, you can talk about hallucinations. There's this entire universe of AI security that people don't really understand, like what is real in that environment. And so we sort of think of explaining the category as AI security, but in practice, like what we're really doing is defining what AI security really is. And what that is giving AI applications and employees a safe and secure way to access company data. And so that's like a gradual journey we have to take our customers on. And eventually they realize, but typically in the first meeting, they don't really know what AI security actually means.
What I tend to see is when there's an emerging category like this, a lot of vendors end up essentially just battling to say, okay, here's our definition. And then they try to force that into the market and evangelize that vision and get the market to embrace and accept their vision. What are you doing to ensure that the market buys into your definition of AI security and not another vendor's?
Yeah, great question. So from my perspective, right, the thing that actually matters is not like, are you making AI secure? That's like obviously a nice instrumental goal, but the actual goal is to make sure that these enterprises can actually deploy AI against extremely valuable use cases, and then ultimately trust that that AI is being deployed in a secure way. And so what we've really focused on is not so much like, here's our definition of what AI security is, market, go out and accept that. What we're really focusing on is like asking our customers, hey, like what are the actual things that you're trying to do? What are the problems? What are the security concerns that you actually have in real life? And like, which of those security concerns are like theoretical and which of them are the ones that you're actually concretely worried about, right? So there's like, when you're building an internal AI application, there's some sort of theoretical worry that like one of your employees might go rogue and try and inject some nonsense into a prompt. But typically that's something that you can risk accept because your employees are actually pretty trustworthy, right? And, you've done all these background checks on them and you give them a high degree of autonomy in the company anyway, right? But what you actually can't risk accept is the idea that an honest employee might like log into the system and ask a question like, what's the company's strategy? And the AI accidentally retrieves an email from the CEO's inbox that's like, hey, we're going to fire the entire engineering org tomorrow, right? And like, that's not something that you can just risk accept. You actually have to freaking deal with that potential issue. And so that's what we try and do is we try and just ask our customers, like, which of these security problems at the end of the day are you just going to risk accept? And which of the ones are you not going to risk accept and you actually need to solve? And then when we take our customers on that journey, it tends to emerge that the core problems that people really feel like they need to solve, how do I manage the permissions of my data? And how do I make sure that my use of AI is compliant with the law, right? How do I make sure that it's auditable, that it's fair, that it's unbiased, that I can go to a regulator and say, my use of AI is defensible, right? And those are the actual problems that no matter how you want to like explain to the market, like you should care about this, these are the problems that unlock value at the enterprise, right? And that's what we're really focused on is like, what do you need to do to unlock value?
We're already about 2 months into 2024. So I'm sure you've already finished up your 2024 planning. In that 2024 plan, what are those top priorities? And then what's keeping you up at night when it comes to thinking about making those priorities happen and executing on those priorities?
Yeah, another great question. So our mission is really helping enterprises make AI safe and useful in the industries that matter the most to human welfare. So our 2024 plan is really all about continuing to realize that. So today, I think our product does just an incredible job of operationalizing AI on unstructured data, right? Documents, PDFs, images, videos, that sort of thing. But obviously a massive amount of company data is actually like the structured stuff, your data warehouse, your production databases, the sensors on your drones, all that stuff. And so we've really only just started delivering against that vision recently, but we've already seen like huge demand to be able to do the sorts of things that these models can do rather than it just being on like simple text, for it to be on a 1 billion row SQL table or something. And there's a huge amount of product work to do there. And then I think beyond that, I do actually still eventually expect the market to mature and for there to be like hundreds of these AI vendors trying to sell AI applications, right? And those applications will need access to various bits and bobs of your data. In this conversation right now that we're having, there'll be an AI that briefs you for this podcast, and that AI will need to talk to the AI that briefs me for this podcast, right? And yours will be sharing the themes most relevant to your audience, and mine will be sharing the data that's like relevant. And they'll be going back and forth to try and figure out what are the interesting topics for discussion for Credal. And then obviously that will be slightly different for the next guest, right? And that exchange of information will need to be governed because I want the AI to help brief you, but I also don't necessarily want it to accidentally reveal that I'm trying to get Ilya fired or that I'm in a dispute with Satya Nadella or whatever. And obviously that's a joke, but the point is that governing that sort of interaction in a way that's deterministic and not actually left up to chance is going to be really important. And I think Credal is honestly the only business that can actually do that. So that's like our big 2024 vision. Now, in terms of what keeps me up at night, 100% of that is the talent component. So at Credal, we're just obsessed with having insanely high talent, insanely high caliber talent. I think part of our hiring process is after the interview process, when you've like wowed all of our employees, during our reference process, we'll actually ask your references, hey, like, is this person actually the best person you've ever worked with? Or maybe one of the best 2 or 3 people you've ever worked with, right? And if we don't get the references to say like, yes, this is one of the best people I've ever worked with, then we're just not able to make a hire because that's what we expect amazing people want to work with. And so I, as a founder, have chosen to hold this insanely high bar. It's pretty scary to me that that might be a mistake, right? Because obviously the higher you hold the bar, the narrower the talent pool that you can hire from is. Now, I will say that we've been lucky so far in being able to hire like an absolutely exceptional team, but we just have so much work to do. And scaling the team whilst preserving that bar is a daunting task. And it's definitely the thing that I think is most likely to be a disruptive force for our ability to execute on our vision. So again, going to just repeat the call to action that I had a while ago, which is if you guys, there are any amazing software engineers or product marketing people out there listening to this, please, I really want to hear from you. I really want to build a future with you. So yeah, get in touch.
Final question for you before we wrap up here. Let's zoom out 3 to 5 years into the future. What's the big picture vision?
Yeah, great. Well, kind of what I said just a second ago, we're making enterprises able to actually deploy AI in a way that's both safe and useful in the industries that matter the most to human welfare. And what that actually means, right, is the access controlled data lake for your AI employees. So all of the company's data, whether it's structured, unstructured, images, videos, drone sensors, everything, all together in one place in a way that AI can actually understand that data and can also understand who should have access to what parts of it. And that's, the core of what we're building. We believe that the long-term story for AI will be, it won't be like one workplace assistant. It will be like hundreds, maybe thousands of little workplace assistants that will have specific jobs to do and will need to access like different parts of your data. And the AIs will need to communicate across, not just within a company, but across companies, right? Google will need to talk to the AI at Google's customers and vice versa. And so I think every enterprise is going to need a good way to govern that sort of behavior of these AIs, but also to control and secure that behavior. And fundamentally, I think what that does is it is actually the key unlock for enabling this like incredible technology to actually be valuable in the industries that are so important that, the government cares about what you're doing. So healthcare, education, financial services, housing, like these are the really, really critical industries. And I think these are the industries that are going to care the most about the security and compliance component of how they deploy AI. So we want to make it safe, we want to make it useful, and we want to create a world in which AI is actually realizing its potential for human welfare and isn't just like some toy. So that's what we're trying to do.
Amazing. I love the vision and I've really loved this conversation. I know it's going to be a big hit with the audience. We are up on time, so we're going to have to wrap. Before we do, if there's any founders that are listening in or talent that's listening in, where should they go?
So you can find us on LinkedIn or at our website, Credal.ai. That's Credal.ai. And then you can also just reach out to me straight up at Ravin@Credal.ai if you have questions or you're curious about working at Credal.
Amazing. Ravin, thank you so much for taking the time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thanks, Brett.
All right. Keep in touch.
This episode of Category Visionaries is brought to you by Frontlines Media, Silicon Valley's leading podcast production studio. If you're a B2B founder looking for help launching and growing your own podcast, visit frontlines.io/podcast. And for the latest episode, search for Category Visionaries on your podcast platform of choice. Thanks for listening, and we'll catch you on the next episode.